So I'm Mairead MacSweeney and I study how the brain processes language. And I do that mainly by working with people who are born profoundly deaf. So my main research question is how the brain processes language and how language develops, language development. And I look at this by working with people who are born profoundly deaf, and working with people who are born profoundly deaf gives us a unique perspective into this question. Because if we only think about language use and language in the brain in people who are hearing and use spoken language, then it's really hard to pull apart the low-level sound processing from the higher-level language processing about what words actually mean, for example. And the same if we only look at people who are deaf and think about sign language. It's really hard to pull apart low-level visual processing from higher-level language processing. But by contrasting the two and looking at the networks in the brain that are shared by processing sign language and spoken language, then that tells us that these areas of the brain are really interested in language itself, regardless of whether it's coming in through the eyes or through the ears. So deafness and sign language gives us this unique perspective into language and language in the brain. So we found, in terms of basic science research questions, we found that, perhaps surprisingly, the brain cares very little about whether language comes in through the eyes or through the ears. The brain cares that language is language, and what we don't yet understand is what patterns in the languages, whether it's sign or speech, the brain's picking up on that stimulates these areas in the left hemisphere in most people. So that's the next step, but actually the overlap in the regions that are activated in the brain for sign and for speech are very similar. So that's one of our major findings. And then with regard to reading, we've also found that deaf children who lip read well tend to become better readers later in life. And so how well a very young child can lip read is a good predictor of their later reading outcome. And we have other research that supports this and has encouraged us to now develop a reading intervention for deaf children to train deaf children's lip reading, to help them map the patterns on the lips, like B onto the letter B, M, whatever, to help them map what they see of speech onto the letters on the page, which we're going to trial this very soon, and we hope that this will lead to improvements in their reading outcomes. So my research is interesting for society for two reasons. So one is that we can ask these basic science questions about how does the environment and experience shape the brain, how does it shape how language is processed in the brain, how does it shape language development. And we can't obviously do that in an experimental setting. We can't take a child and say they're not going to receive any spoken language and therefore let's look at how they develop. But we can look at these children who are born deaf and look at how their language development, what differences they have in their language environment, how that affects their language development and their neurobiology of language. So there's interesting basic science questions we can address. But then in terms of the broader society, this will come as a surprise to most people, but most deaf children find it very difficult to learn to read. And the reason for this is that when we read a spoken language written on a page. And a deaf child, if they've never heard the word cat, then they will struggle to make sense of these squiggles on the page. And many deaf children leave school age 16 with a reading age of around 10 years old, despite the fact that their non-verbal IQ is absolutely fine. So this obviously has massive implications for their vocational attainment. So this is a major part of my research, to look at reading development and reading attainment in deaf children. And if we can improve that, then we can have a big impact on society by increasing the contribution that deaf children, deaf adults can make to society.